There's a version of creative advice that sounds really healthy. Take breaks, rest, don't let your work consume you. Have hobbies, protect your boundaries, make art, but don't make art your whole personality. And look, some of that is genuinely good advice. Burnout is real. Rest matters. A life lived entirely inside one project can collapse in on itself. But I want to push on something underneath all of that, because I think there's a piece of the conversation about creativity that we've quietly stopped having because it makes us uncomfortable. And it's this: every artist whose work has ever genuinely stopped you in your tracks, who made something that felt impossible, that felt like it came from somewhere beyond ordinary human effort, was, at some point, completely consumed by what they were making. Not balanced, not boundaried, consumed. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Before I tell you why, please subscribe, join, and donate to Lightbulb Letters. It really helps. Let's talk about what obsession actually is, because the word carries a lot of baggage. We use it like a warning sign. She's obsessed. He can't let it go. As if obsession is something that happens to people who've lost perspective, who need an intervention, who should probably talk to someone. But there's another way to look at it. Obsession is sustained, involuntary attention. It's what happens when your mind decides something matters enough to keep returning to it without being told to. You're not grinding. You're not forcing focus through sheer discipline. You're being pulled. The thing has you more than you have the thing. And that quality, that being pulled, is not incidental to genius. It might be the whole engine. Think about the artists, scientists, writers, musicians who we now consider exceptional. The pattern is almost embarrassingly consistent. Darwin spent 20 years thinking about natural selection before he published, not dabbling, obsessing. He thought about it in the garden, at the dinner table, during his daily walks. His wife wrote in letters that she sometimes felt she was living with a man who was only partly present to her because he was fully present to the idea. Toni Morrison wrote Beloved while working a full-time job as an editor and raising 2 sons alone. She woke before dawn every day. She has said she thought about those characters constantly. Seth, Beloved, the weight of that history in the spaces between everything else. The book lived in her for years before it came out. Michelangelo slept in his clothes and his boots while painting the Sistine Chapel because taking them off felt like too much time away from the ceiling. You can write these off as extreme cases, outliers, but the extreme cases are useful precisely because they make the mechanism visible. These weren't people with unusually good work ethics. They were people who had been taken over by something, and that takeover is what made the work possible. Here's why obsession matters in a way that discipline alone can't replicate. Deep creative work requires an almost unreasonable amount of time inside a single problem, not surface time, not the hour you scheduled on your calendar, but the kind of time where you've gone so far into something that you start seeing structure nobody showed you, connections that aren't in any reference book, solutions that emerge not from effort but from saturation. This is what researchers call incubation. Your conscious mind steps back and your unconscious keeps working. But incubation only happens if the problem is present enough in your mind to keep processing when you're not actively attending to it. If you put the work down and genuinely leave it, if it doesn't follow you into the shower, into sleep, into the middle of dinner, the incubation doesn't happen. You come back the next day to a cold problem. Obsession keeps the problem warm. It means the work never fully stops, even when you're not in the studio. The ideas are turning over underneath everything else you do. And that's where the unexpected breakthroughs come from. Not the scheduled sessions, but the oblique angles that only appear when you've been inside something long enough. There's also something obsession does to quality that nothing else quite replicates. When you are obsessed with something, your standards become almost irrational because the work matters to you in a way that goes beyond logic. You become incapable of letting mediocre pass. You redo things that most people would never notice. You chase a specific feeling in the work rather than an acceptable outcome, And acceptable outcomes are never enough because the feeling isn't there yet. This is maddening to live with, but it's also what separates work that merely functions from work that haunts. The person who works on something until it's good enough and the person who works on something until it feels right are not in the same relationship with their work. And that difference in relationship, that gap between good enough and feels right, is where a certain kind of excellence lives. You cannot manufacture that standard through discipline. You have to care too much. Obsession is caring too much. It's the operating condition for that level of attention to quality. Now, here's the part I want to be careful about, because this isn't a case for burning yourself to the ground. Obsession that has no container destroys people. The artists who came apart, who lost relationships, health, sanity, lives, weren't undone by caring too much about the work. They were undone by the absence of anything around the obsession to hold it. No rest, no body, no other humans, no ground beneath the fire. The obsession isn't the danger. The isolation of the obsession is the danger. What the greatest creative lives tend to have, and this is something worth looking at closely, is obsession inside a structure. Routines that protect the body while the mind burns. Relationships that survive because someone understood the terms. Rest. That is real rest, not collapse. The obsession is allowed to be total, but it exists inside a life that can carry it. This is not balance in the way we usually mean it. It's not equal time for work and play, equal weight given to the painting and the grocery list. It's more like a burning core with just enough structure around it to keep the whole thing from consuming itself. And then there's the question of what you're obsessed with and whether you chose it. Because this is something nobody talks about, honestly. You cannot manufacture obsession. You can't decide to be obsessed with something because it would be strategically useful to be obsessed with it. You can't will yourself into that state. It either has you or it doesn't. What you can do is pay attention to what already has you. There's something, maybe there are a few things that your mind returns to without being asked. Something you think about in the space between tasks. Something that makes you feel slightly more alive when you talk about it. Something you would keep doing even if you knew for certain no one would ever see it. That's not a hobby. That's a signal. So the question isn't really whether obsession is necessary for genius. It is. The evidence of every exceptional creative life points to it, and the mechanics of deep creative works explain why. Sustained involuntary attention, irrational standards, incubation, the refusal to settle, none of that happens at a comfortable distance from the work. The real question is whether you're willing to be claimed, whether you're willing to let the thing that already has your attention actually have it fully, without apology, without managing it down into something more socially acceptable and less dangerous, and easier to explain at dinner. Genius isn't a level of talent you reach, it's a depth of investment you allow. And the terrifying, liberating truth is that most of us are keeping ourselves at the surface on purpose.